5 days ago, Tyson Foods shut down its beef processing plant in Joslin, Illinois, Rock Island County. It had been running for 43 years. Roughly 2,500 people worked there. It processed about 3,000 cattle a day. The harvest floor stopped on the 13th of August. The last meat came off the line on the 14th. On the same announcement, Tyson closed a facility in Eagle Mountain, Utah, and put its plant in Pasco, Washington, up for sale. 3 towns, 1 announcement, and almost nobody outside those towns noticed. If you want to know what happens to Joslin next, not what people fear will happen, but what actually happens, on what timeline, in what order, you don't have to guess. There is already a town that ran the entire experiment to completion. It's called Lexington, Nebraska, and in January of this year, Tyson closed its plant there too. Here's what makes Lexington worth your attention, and it isn't the size of the loss, although the loss was enormous. 3,200 people lost their jobs in a town of roughly 10,000, more than 30% of the population. It's this: Lexington was not a dying town. That sentence should stop you, because it contradicts almost everything you have been told about American towns that lose their factories. The story you know goes like this. A place peaked sometime around 1955. The industry left in the 70s or 80s, and the town has been slowly emptying ever since. Decline as a long, sad tale. Decline as history. Lexington doesn't fit that at all. The plant opened in 1990. Tyson bought it about a decade later. And in the years that followed, Lexington did something that almost no small town in the American interior managed to do. It nearly doubled in population. It got younger. It built out neighborhoods. It ran a good school system. It had a movie theater. People moved there on purpose, from other countries, because there was work. Lexington wasn't a town that peaked in 1955. By most measures, Lexington peaked around 2020. And then, in a single January, it lost a third of its jobs. That is the argument of this video, and I want to state it plainly before we go any further, because everything that follows depends on it. Urban death in America is not a historical residue. It is not something that happened to the Rust Belt decades ago and is now just playing out. It is an active, ongoing mechanism, and it is fully capable of killing a town that is still growing in under 60 days right now. Lexington is the proof. Joslin is the next test. Now, the obvious explanation for all of this is that Tyson made a bad call, or got greedy, or found somewhere cheaper. And that explanation is wrong. Not partly wrong, structurally wrong. Tyson didn't close Lexington because of anything that happened in Lexington. In January of this year, the United States Department of Agriculture reported that the national cattle herd had fallen to 86.2 million head. That is the smallest herd this country has had since 1951. Tyson's beef division is now forecasting an operating loss of between $500 and $650 million for this financial year. The decision that killed Lexington wasn't made in a boardroom in Arkansas. It was made, incrementally, in thousands of feedlots across the American plains, over a period of about 3 years by ranchers most of us will never hear of, responding to drought and cost and risk. And once those decisions were made, the arithmetic locked. Nothing Lexington did, and nothing Lexington could have done, was going to change the outcome. So, over the next 20 minutes, we're going to do 3 things. We're going to look at exactly what Tyson built in Lexington, and how quickly. We're going to work through the cattle mathematics that made the closure inevitable years before it was announced. And then, we're going to look at the one mechanism that determines whether a town like this ever comes back. A mechanism that has almost nothing to do with jobs. Lexington sits almost exactly in the middle of the United States. Central Nebraska, along Highway 283, surrounded by corn, grain silos, and cattle. It is the kind of place that most Americans have driven past without registering. Before 1990, it was a small agricultural town doing what small agricultural towns in Nebraska do. Then the plant opened, and everything about the place changed. Understand what a beef plant of this size actually is. At capacity, Lexington processed around 5,000 head of cattle every day. According to the University of Nebraska's Center for Agricultural Profitability, That was roughly 4.8% of the entire daily beef slaughter of the United States. Sit with that number for a second. Nearly 1 in every 20 cattle killed in America went through a single town of 10,000 people in central Nebraska. That scale needs workers, thousands of them, and the work is hard. Cleaning crews, forklifts, the slaughter floor, trimming cuts of meat. It is cold, physical, relentless, and it does not require a degree or fluent English. So people came. Over the next 3 decades, Lexington's population nearly doubled, and the town that emerged was not the town that had existed in 1989. According to the 2023 American Community Survey, about 41% of Lexington's residents were born outside the United States. Around 60% identified as Hispanic. About 17% of the immigrant population came from Africa. This is the part of the American story that gets left out of the usual factory town narrative, so I want to be precise about the mechanism rather than the politics. A plant needed labor. The labor came. And because the work paid, the people who came stayed. Not for a season, but for careers. There are people in Lexington who worked that slaughter floor for over 30 years and retired out of it. They bought houses, they raised children, they joined churches, they opened restaurants that fed the shift workers coming off the line. And the town built around them. Leafy neighborhoods, recreation centers, a one-screen movie theater, a school system with a genuinely good reputation. Here is the detail that matters more than any of that, and it becomes the whole story by the end of this video. School officials in Lexington estimated that nearly half of the students in the district had a parent working at the Tyson plant. Not a parent working in town, not a parent in agriculture, a parent at that specific facility. Think about what that number actually describes. It means the plant wasn't the largest employer in Lexington in the way that a hospital is the largest employer in a mid-sized city, one big institution among many. It means the plant was the household economy of the town. The classrooms were a near-perfect map of the payroll. And that is the definition of a company town, in a form far more concentrated than most of the historic examples people think of. Not a town where a company is dominant, a town where the company and the population are, functionally, the same set of people. By 2020, Lexington had achieved something genuinely rare. It was a small town in the rural American interior that was growing, not shrinking. It was younger than its neighbors, not older. It had a tax base, a school system, a main street with businesses on it, and a steady supply of work that did not require credentials. Whatever you think about how it happened, the outcome was that in a region defined by decades of population loss, this one town had figured out how to gain. It had built its entire recovery on a single building. And in November of 2025, with no warning, that building announced it was closing. The announcement came just before Thanksgiving. The first reaction across Lexington was not grief. It was disbelief. Residents assumed it was a rumor. It didn't make sense. Why would the largest employer in town, a plant that had run for 35 years, simply shut down? People asked each other whether they'd heard it right. They had heard it right. Tyson said it was closing the Lexington facility to, in the company's phrasing, right-size its beef business. The plant would cease operations on or about the 20th of January, 2026. That is roughly 60 days from announcement to closure. 2 months to absorb the end of a town's economy. The numbers involved were not marginal. Around 3,200 people worked there, in a town of approximately 10,000. More than 30% of the entire population of Lexington was employed at that single facility, and the direct job losses were only the first layer. A report released by the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, estimated that total job losses across Lexington and the surrounding counties would reach approximately 7,000. The plant workers themselves were projected to lose an estimated $241 million in wages and benefits every year. That analysis used the in-plan economic modeling framework, which traces spending through regional supply chains to capture the full multiplier effect. The knock-on effects run through everything. When a third of a town stops earning, the shops lose customers, the restaurants lose customers, the landlords lose tenants, the school district loses students, and with them, funding. Every one of those is its own round of layoffs, arriving 3 to 12 months behind the first. Michael Hicks, who directs the Center for Business and Economic Research at Ball State University, described what was coming for Lexington as close to a poster child for hard times. The state-level arithmetic is stark, too. Analysis cited by the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City put the annual statewide economic impact of the closure at more than $3 billion. Nebraska was projected to lose around $23 million a year in personal income tax revenue and another $10 million a year in sales tax. One plant, in one town of 10,000. The closure itself was not a single event, and this is a detail worth understanding because it is how these things actually happen. On the 20th of January, the plant stopped operating, but Tyson retained around 292 employees to handle closure-related work. Decommissioning, cleaning, paperwork. Less than half of them remained past the end of that month. The rest were terminated on a staggered schedule across the following 6 months. The final group, 127 people, worked their last day on Friday, the 24th of July, 2026, less than a month ago, so the closure that was announced in November 2025 did not actually finish until 3 weeks ago. For 8 months, Lexington existed in a state where the plant was closed but not empty, where a few hundred people still drove to work at a facility whose only remaining function was to dismantle itself. And during those same 8 months, the exodus began. Workers with no roots in Lexington left first. That is always how it goes. Others moved to Columbus, Nebraska, or across the state line to Garden City, Kansas, chasing the same work at plants that were still running. Which raises the question this video actually exists to answer. Why did this happen? Not the corporate explanation, not right-sizing, the actual mechanism. Because the answer isn't in Lexington at all. It isn't even in Arkansas, where Tyson is headquartered. To find it, you have to look at a number that has been moving in one direction for 7 straight years. On the 1st of January, 2026, the United States Department of Agriculture counted the national cattle herd. 86.2 million head of cattle and calves. That is the smallest the American herd has been since 1951. 75 years. Break it down further and it gets worse. The beef cow herd specifically, the breeding animals, the ones that produce next year's supply, came in at 27.6 million head. That marked the 7th consecutive year of contraction. And the 2025 calf crop, at 32.9 million head, was the lowest since 1941. Now, why does that close a meatpacking plant? Because a beef plant is a fixed cost machine. The building, the equipment, the refrigeration, the regulatory compliance, the core staff. Those costs exist whether you run 5,000 cattle through the line or 2,000. Profit in packing comes from volume and from the spread between what you pay for a live animal and what you sell the meat for. When cattle become scarce, both sides of that equation move against you at once. Packers compete for a shrinking supply, which drives acquisition costs to record highs. And they run their lines below capacity, which means the fixed costs are spread across fewer animals. Tyson's beef division lost more than $1 billion in 2025. For the 2026 financial year, the company raised its projected beef operating loss to somewhere between $500 and $650 million. So, why did the herd shrink? Several forces, all pointing the same way. Multi-year drought across the plains, elevated feed costs, rising operating expenses, diesel, fertilizer, equipment parts, and in response, ranchers made a rational individual decision. Instead of holding back heifers to breed and rebuild, they sold them. That decision is the hinge of this entire story, so let me be precise about what it means. A heifer held back for breeding, what the industry tracks as heifer retention rate, is a cost today and a revenue 3 years from now. A heifer sold is cash today. When margins are tight and drought is burning your grass, you sell. Thousands of ranchers independently made that call, and every one of them was right for their own operation. Collectively, they liquidated the future supply. This is what the industry calls the cattle cycle. The roughly 10-year boom and bust rhythm between herd expansion and contraction, driven by that same biological and economic logic playing out across thousands of individual operations simultaneously. We are, right now, at the bottom of one of the deepest contractions in that cycle in 70 years, and there is no fast way back. It takes roughly 3 years from the moment a rancher decides to retain a heifer until her offspring is ready for market. That is biology. No amount of capital, policy, or demand can compress it, which produces the fact that reframes everything about Lexington. No significant increase in American beef production is possible before 2028. The USDA's 2026 report did show a modest uptick, about 1% more heifers held back for breeding. That is the first faint signal of a turnaround. But it will take several consecutive years of that before the herd approaches sustainable levels. So when Tyson announced the Lexington closure in November of 2025, the company was not reacting to a bad quarter. It was reading a supply curve that had already been determined by decisions made in feedlots in 2022 and 2023. The cattle that would have kept Lexington running were never born. Lexington was killed 3 years before it closed. Nobody in Lexington knew because there was nothing in Lexington to see. 2 further pressures deepened it. The United States closed its border to Mexican feeder cattle over concerns about New World screwworm, cutting off a flow of roughly 1.2 million head a year. A phased reopening began on the 24th of August, 2026, initially limited to the port at Douglas, Arizona, and to cattle from Sonora and Chihuahua. That will help at the margins. It will not restore the volume quickly, and in Nebraska specifically, the Morrill Fire, the largest wildfire in the state's history, burned more than 820,000 acres of grazing land and displaced an estimated 40,000 cattle. Destroyed fencing and forage meant that even surviving animals couldn't be supported locally. The herd rebuild in the Central Plains, in other words, has effectively been paused. Which brings us to the mechanism that turns a temporary shortage into a permanent one. And it has a name almost nobody outside the industry has heard. In the meatpacking industry, capacity is measured in something called shackle space. It refers, literally, to the physical positions on a processing line, the number of animals a facility can handle. Industry-wide, it's the total slaughter capacity available in the country. Here is why that word matters more than any other in this story. When a plant closes, its shackle space does not go into storage. The building is decommissioned. The specialized equipment is stripped or scrapped. The workforce, thousands of people carrying skills that took years to develop, disperses across 3 states. The regulatory approvals lapse. That capacity is gone, not paused, gone. And rebuilding it is not a matter of flipping a switch when demand returns. It means new construction, new capital, new permitting, new hiring, new training. Years and hundreds of millions of dollars. Now put that together with the timeline from a moment ago, and you get the mechanism. The herd shrinks, margins collapse, plants close. Shackle space is permanently removed. Then, eventually, ranchers begin rebuilding the herd because prices are high and the incentive returns. But when those cattle are ready, 3 years later, there is nowhere to process them. Which caps the rebuild, which suppresses the incentive to rebuild further, which keeps the herd small, which keeps the remaining plants under pressure. This is a ratchet. It only turns one way, and this is not a theoretical concern invented for a video. It is what people inside the industry are openly worried about right now. Cattlemen considering whether to grow their herds are asking whether enough shackle space will remain open for however large the national herd eventually builds back to. Industry bodies have publicly stressed the importance of maintaining adequate processing capacity, precisely so that a rebuild is possible. There is a second layer to this, and it is worth being fair about, because it complicates the villain narrative. The plants closing are the old ones. Lexington opened in 1990. Joslin had been running for 43 years. Many American beef plants date to the 1960s, and they are genuinely less efficient than what is being built now. Tyson is not alone in making this calculation. JBS, the second largest beef packer in the country, closed its Souderton, Pennsylvania facility the same summer, citing the same supply pressures. The whole industry is consolidating toward fewer, larger, more modern operations. Facilities like the sustainable beef plant that opened in North Platte, Nebraska in May 2025, or the producer-owned beef plant under construction in Amarillo, Texas, represent what the industry sees as the future model: newer, more efficient, and owned closer to the ranch. Tyson, for its part, is consolidating around 3 hubs: Amarillo in Texas, Holcomb in Kansas, and Dakota City in Nebraska. The company says it can maintain a similar level of cattle harvesting across a smaller, more modern network. Analysts estimated the closures could deliver $100 to $150 million a year in cost savings. From a balance sheet, that is a defensible decision, arguably a correct one. But notice what it means on the ground. The efficiency gain is real, and it is captured centrally. The cost is also real, and it is paid entirely by Lexington, by Joslyn, by Eagle Mountain, by whatever town ends up holding Pasco. An economist at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, put the underlying cause plainly. Packers are cutting capacity because profits fell as cattle numbers fell. That's it. There is no conspiracy here and no villain, which is precisely what makes it so difficult to fight. You cannot organize against a supply curve. You cannot petition a drought. There is no decision maker to appeal to, because the decision was distributed across thousands of ranchers over 3 years, and nobody involved thought they were doing anything to Nebraska. So the question becomes, what actually determines whether a town survives this? Not whether it gets a replacement employer. Something much smaller and much earlier, and almost nobody watches it. When a town like Lexington loses its plant, everyone watches the unemployment rate. It's the wrong number. Unemployment is a lagging indicator, and a distorted one. It only counts people who are out of work and actively looking while still living there. The moment someone gives up and moves to Columbus or Garden City, they vanish from the statistic entirely. A town can be hollowing out at speed while its unemployment rate improves. The Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City spelled out the expected pattern for Lexington. Unemployment rises, the labor force contracts, and net outmigration increases. All 3 at once. The second and third quietly cancel out the first. Here is the number that actually tells you what is happening. School enrollment. Recall from earlier that nearly half of Lexington's students had a parent working at the Tyson plant. That makes the school district the single most sensitive instrument in the town, and it moves first. A family deciding whether to leave doesn't wait for the census. They decide in the spring, based on where they want their children starting in September. Enrollment registers the decision months before any economic statistic does. But enrollment isn't just a signal, it's the mechanism. School funding is driven substantially by enrollment. Fewer students means less funding, which means fewer teachers, larger classes, cut programs, which makes the school worse, which means the next family with the means to leave, and it is always the families with the most options who move first has a stronger reason to go. That is the second ratchet in this story, and it operates on families rather than cattle. The plant closure is a single shock. The school spiral is a slow, compounding one, and it is what converts a bad year into a permanently smaller town. There is a further dimension in Lexington's case. Because the workforce was so heavily immigrant, the people most likely to leave are the people who came for the work in the first place. Lexington's library director spoke about her fear that the town would lose its identity, that a large share of the immigrant population would simply have to go because the jobs that brought them no longer exist. That's not just a population loss. It's the reversal of the exact process that built modern Lexington. The plant drew people in for 30 years. Its closure sends them back out. The town doesn't return to what it was in 1989 either. In 1989, it had a functioning small-town economy sized to its population. What it has now is the infrastructure of a town of 10,000. The schools, the water system, the roads, the recreation centers, the debt that paid for all of it, and an uncertain fraction of the tax base needed to maintain any of it. That gap is where towns actually die, not in the closure. In the decade afterwards, in deferred maintenance and consolidated school districts, and a main street that empties one lease at a time. Which brings us back to Joslin, Illinois. 2,500 people, 43 years, Rock Island County. The line stopped on the 13th of August, 5 days ago. Everything in this video is now that town's near future, running on a known timeline. The staggered terminations over the following months. The first wave of departures among workers without local roots. The spin-off layoffs in the shops and restaurants that served the shift. The school enrollment figures next spring that nobody outside the district will read. And the same absence of anyone to hold responsible, because the cattle that would have kept Joslin open were never born either. Which leaves the argument we started with. We are used to thinking of dying American towns as a finished story, something that happened in the 70s, to the Rust Belt, to places that peaked long ago. That framing is comfortable because it puts the damage safely in the past. Lexington should end it. Lexington was growing. Lexington was young. Lexington had done the thing every rural American town is told to do, and it worked for 30 years. Then a number moved in a USDA spreadsheet, and 60 days later a third of the town was out of work. It isn't history, it's a mechanism, and it's still running.